Okay, so we continue with our study of what I call the industrial organization, basically the behavior of firms. Recall last week we discussed the various costs, various measures of costs in the context of production. And now we're going to apply some of those ideas to this context. So, we're going to apply those ideas to the problem of how much and when to produce for what we call competitive firms. Okay, so firms that are in perfect competition with each other. So the kind of questions that we're going to deal with are first defining perfect competition. What does it mean? This is something that will need a little bit of care. Defining this concept of marginal revenue, for today it's going to be very, very simple. It's going to be a no-brainer, but next week when we deal with monopoly, the concept of marginal revenue will start having some substance, some bite. Then we will discuss the quantity decision of perfectly competitive firms, that is, how much a perfectly competitive firm produces. And finally, we will discuss the question of shutdown, that is, when should a perfectly competitive firm produce at all, okay, and when should it instead just stop producing altogether, exit the market. Okay, and this will depend on whether we are in the short run, which, as we remember from last week, is defined as, so collect your thoughts for 1 minute and recall what the short run means as far as this course is concerned. All right? Short run means, so have a think about that, versus the long run. Okay? So the decision as to when to produce will depend on whether we are in one case or the other. Okay? Is the construction work bothering you a little bit? Yeah, I'm not sure what we can do about it. Shall I go and tell them off? No, poor guys. They're here working their asses off on New Year's Eve. Well, let's just tahan, okay? Okay, so there's the classic example of you, as a young person, you graduate and you decide to open a business, yeah? What kind of decisions will you have to make? Yeah, you have to make decisions about how much to charge, how much to produce, how much of the inputs to use, right? And many other, perhaps more interesting decisions, which we said we are not under the scope of this in the scope of this course. Okay, so marketing decisions and things like that, right? But as far as we are concerned, the important ones are how much to produce, what price to charge, maybe, and how much of the inputs to use we discussed last week. So all of these decisions will depend on two sides, right? One side is your production costs, that is how much it costs to produce a given quantity. And on the other side, it will depend on the demand side, how much you can charge, for example. These kind of things depend on the market rather than you yourself. Okay, so there's two sides. So there's the things that relate to your particular firm, and then there is everything else, which is on the what happens when you face the market. Okay. So what is a competitive market? So everything we discussed today will be in the context of perfect competition. The characteristics of a perfectly competitive market are the presence of many sellers. So as far as the sellers are concerned, they face perfect competition if there's a lot of them, many, many of them, all producing identical products. So there's no differentiation between the various sellers of this product, between the producers. Yeah? There's many of them, and they all produce the same thing. And because of that, as a consequence of these two characteristics, of these two features, they cannot set prices. That is to say, they just take the prices that prevail on the market as given. Yeah? So the idea here is that there is a multitude of these sellers and presumably buyers, but the buyer side we don't need to worry about for now. But let's just say there's lots of buyers, lots of sellers. They're all making the same product. The products are identical, and all of the other sellers are charging a given price. Okay, so this is the price that prevails on the market. The idea here is that you, as an individual seller, don't have the power to set a different price and sell the items. Okay, so the obvious part of this, the bit that will kind of resonate, is, well, of course, if everybody else is selling at a given price and you are selling the same product as everybody else, then of course if you sell at a higher price, nobody's going to buy from you. Right? That's the bit that is intuitively obvious. So that means that the price cannot be higher than the price that prevails in the market, the price that you set. Yeah? This idea of a perfectly competitive market, where all the sellers are price takers, also entails the reverse. Perfectly competitive sellers cannot set the price lower than other sellers. Okay? So this is the bit that is kind of an assumption that is being made about the behavior of firms. Okay? It's, at this stage, it will be somewhat unsatisfactory. You will feel, well, that's just weird, right? If, even though there are many sellers, and even though they're all selling the same thing, why can't I just price less than the others, less than the competition? Okay? So it will turn out that in the long run, there is a reason for this. It's very easy to justify, it's possible to justify this, the fact that the sellers in a perfectly competitive market must just take prices as given, not just in terms of being unable to charge prices higher than the competition, but also unable to charge prices that are lower than the competition. So in the long run, it's possible to justify this. In the short run, it's a little bit weird. We just take it as an assumption. Okay, so this is an assumption about the behavior of perfectly competitive firms. They take prices as given. Okay, so this is, if you go on to study firm behavior later on, this is the essence of perfectly competitive markets, taking prices as given. There is a price on the market that the seller sees, and the seller just charges that price. Okay, does not have the power to charge higher or lower than that price. Okay, so take it as a kind of article of faith. Take it as a definition of perfect competition. Yeah. So the number one and number two really are characteristics, observable characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. So when we see these two things, when we see lots of sellers and we see that they're all selling the same product, then as a consequence, we say that the sellers are all price takers. Okay, so that's the core of the definition of perfect competition. There is an additional characteristic, which is that the firms, the sellers, can freely enter or exit the market. Okay? This is somewhat separate from the idea of price taking. Yeah? These two are independent ideas. So it's, in principle, it's possible to have a market where there's many sellers, they all trade, they all make an identical product, and they take prices given, but there is no free entry or exit. So it's possible to have a situation like that. In the context that we're going to study, for the purposes of this course, we will assume that it's always the case that there is free entry and exit. But let me clarify later on when this free entry and exit condition starts mattering. Okay, so for now, we don't worry so much about the free entry and exit. This will come into play later when we discuss long-run behavior. Okay. Oh, sorry. So to summarize, producers, sellers, firms, whatever you want to call them, take price as given. This is the fundamental characteristic of perfect competition. A secondary characteristic that will be useful later when we discuss the long run is that firms can freely enter the market. Okay, as many firms as, well, not as many, but there's no barrier to entry into this market. Okay. So first, some concept, we have to define this. So last week, remember, we only talked about the cost side. There is, of course, the revenue side. So the definitions are general. So total revenue is simply the price that is being charged times the quantity that is being sold. Okay, assuming all units of the good are being sold at the same price. Yeah. Next week, we will very briefly touch upon the case when it's possible for a seller to sell different units at different prices, but we will touch very briefly. Apart from that case, this is generally the assumption that we make, right? All units of a good in the market have to be sold at the same price. Then there is this, the analog, so total revenue, total cost. The analog of average cost for the revenue side is average revenue. So that's total revenue divided by the quantity. By definition, this will always be equal to the price, right? I mean, it follows straightforwardly from this. And there is the very important concept of marginal revenue, which is the change in revenue due to a change in quantity sold. Okay? So for the purposes of, so for competitive firms, the marginal revenue will just be equal to the price, as we will discuss later. Average revenue being equal to price is also true for other kinds of firms. It doesn't have to be for competitive firms only, right? It just follows from the definition. Okay, so just to make this more concrete, so try it yourselves, fill in the table here. Well, total revenue, just price times quantity, so times, multiply the entries in the first two columns together, right? When quantity is 0, they're not selling anything 0. When price is 10, 1, therefore total revenue is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, okay? So that average revenue, as I said, is just price, right? It's total revenue, which is price times quantity divided by quantity, so you get the price back. So here, the price is constant, regardless of the amount being produced, right? So this competitive firm, we know it's a competitive firm without having been told anything, because as the quantity changes, the price stays the same. Yeah? Remember, this is what price taking means. Price taking means that the price that is charged by the firm for its product is taken as given. In particular, it is independent of the quantity being produced. Okay? So we will contrast this next week with the case of a monopolist, let's say, the opposite of a competitive firm, where the firm has complete power to decide how much to charge for each quantity. Okay? Under the constraint of the demand curve and so on and so forth. But for a competitive firm, which is a price taker, the price is constant with respect to quantity. This is the essence of competitive behavior, right? So price taking equals means is the same as price is constant as far as quantity is concerned. Yeah? The price can change, but not because of the firm's quantity decisions. That's what price taking means. Yeah? So the price in the market, on the market, can change because of changes in demand, for example, right? That's certainly possible. A perfectly competitive market doesn't mean that the price never changes. Yeah? But it means that it never changes because of individual firms' quantity decisions. So from the point of view of an individual firm, the price is constant if that firm is perfectly competitive, if that firm is in a perfectly competitive market. So the price here stays constant, average revenue, which is equal to the price, is constant, so it's 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. And we have marginal revenue, the additional revenue that the firm gets from producing more units, for producing more, is also constant and is equal to the price, as we talked about before, right? So as you compute the total revenue goes from $0 to $10 when you increase the quantity, from 0 to 1. The additional revenue that you get from that increase in quantity of 1 unit is $10. As you increase as you increase the quantity from 1 to 2, the additional revenue that you get is just an extra $10, from $10 to $20, because the price of that additional unit, the second unit being produced, is $10, and so on and so forth. Because the price stays constant for the competitive firm, marginal revenue simply equals the price. Yeah? So this is what the revenue side looks like for a perfectly competitive firm. The firm, basically, everything is constant. Average revenue, margin revenue is just equal to the price. So here is 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 everywhere, okay? As I said, marginal revenue equals price, okay? So for the competitive firm, marginal revenue just equals price. So what this means is that as I said, competitive firm, price taking, price is essentially constant as far as quantity is concerned, right? This is what price taking behavior means. So that's why the marginal revenue just equals price, right? So the additional revenue that the firm gets for producing one more unit, yeah, given that the price is the same, is the price that it charges for that one unit, which is given by the market, okay, which is not under its control. So contrast this. Why is this a big deal? Contrast this with what you usually might think about the price charged by a firm, right? So usually when we think about pricing decisions by firms, there is this idea that, for example, there is quantity discounts, right? So the more you sell of something, the lower the price of that thing is, right? The less you sell of something, maybe that the good that is being sold is, only this guy can sell it, then the more you can charge for it, right? So in our minds, intuitively, this is the relationship between quantity and price, even at the individual firm level, right? This is what, if you were, as I said at the beginning, if you were to run your own business, this could be one of the decisions that you have to make, one of the trade-offs that you have to make. Do I produce more at a lower price, or do I sell less at a higher price? Yeah? Now, the key here that I really, really want to emphasize, this cannot be belabored, okay? It cannot be emphasized too much, is for this very special case of a competitive firm, this trade-off does not exist. Yeah? The competitive firm does not face a trade-off between quantity and price. It doesn't make this, there's no pricing process by which the owner of the competitive firm, the manager of the competitive firm goes, but if I sell more, if I produce more, then I'll have to lower the price to sell the extra units. There is none of that, okay? So the competitive firm cannot charge different prices. It takes the price as given. Therefore, the price of any additional unit sold is always going to, the marginal revenue obtained from any additional unit sold is always going to be equal to the price that prevails on the market. Okay, so the pricing decision essentially is taken out of the hands of the managers, owners, or whatever of a competitive firm. This is a very, very special circumstance, as you can imagine. As I said, intuitively, this is not how people do business, right? This is not how firms do business. Typically, there is some kind of trade-off. Now, we will discuss that case next week. But for now, we focus on this very particular case where this decision just doesn't exist, okay? So recall we started motivating the study of industrial organization, these 3 chapters, these 3 weeks, by saying, we're studying the decisions of firms. Yeah. Now, and I already said that most of the decisions which one would find interesting about firm behavior, which we'll study about in, let's say, management courses or marketing courses or whatever, are not covered in microeconomics, right? How to market a product, how to position it, and stuff like that. None of that is there. Yeah. Furthermore, so the only decisions that basically we study are going to be how much to produce, when to produce, and maybe how much to charge. In the case of the competitive firm, this decision even is not there. Okay, so the competitive firm basically faces only 2 decisions, right? As far as our models in microeconomics are concerned, namely how much to produce, given a price that is set outside, that is not under the firm's control, and when to produce. These are basically the only 2 decisions that we're going to discuss. And that's because the marginal revenue that it faces is just constant. So, as I said, the only decisions left are how much to produce and when to produce. So how much to produce? How much does a firm produce? What is the quantity that it sells? So recall from last week, the first thing that we discussed was the objectives of the firm. As far as this course is concerned, as far as microeconomics is concerned, there is only one objective of firms, and that is to maximize profits. Okay? So the quantity decision is made in order to maximize profits. The quantity that it will be produced by any firm is the quantity that maximizes profits. So one of the principles of this course of introductory microeconomics is marginal decision making, right? So we can analyze decisions made by any agent by looking at the margin, basically the additional, the last unit of something being done. Here is production. So the margin, in this case, is the margin of production. So there are 2 sides to the production decision, to the decision to produce 1 more unit. So if you produce 1 more unit, if you produce and sell 1 more unit, you get more revenue. That's the marginal revenue side. But you also incur more costs because of that additional unit that you've produced, right? So more revenue because you sold 1 more unit, but also more costs because you made 1 more unit. So there's marginal revenue, marginal cost. The profit is the difference between revenue and costs. Therefore, the decision is going to be based on a comparison of the additional revenue that you get by producing more and the additional costs that you incur by producing more. When the additional revenue that you get, namely the marginal revenue, exceeds the additional costs, then it's profitable to increase production. Right? You make 1 more thing, it costs you something extra, the marginal cost, but you get more revenue for that than the costs that you incurred, so your profits will increase. Conversely, if the marginal revenue is below marginal cost, then it's not worth increasing production by 1 unit. Right? In fact, you should reduce production because this last unit costs you more in production costs than you're getting in terms of additional revenue. Yeah? So the point at which the firm will produce is where marginal revenue exactly equals marginal cost. Yeah? Assuming that the quantity can be adjusted in such a way that it is possible to equalize the 2, then that's the point at which production will stop. Right? Because you produce any further, and then marginal revenue will be less than the marginal cost. If you produce any less, then the marginal cost will be less than the marginal revenue, and it's worthwhile to produce more than that. Yeah? So these 2 forces, if you like, when they're exactly equal, that's the point at which you will have maximized costs, where there will be no further profit to be made by increasing or decreasing production. So continuing the earlier example. So given the price is constant, so recall the price is constant, so marginal revenue stays constant with quantity. And suppose that costs look like this, okay? So total costs are obviously increasing in the quantity that is being produced, okay? Marginal cost also is increasing here. Each additional unit that is being produced costs more and more to produce, okay? So that's not something that must always be the case. It is not the case, okay? So it's not that for every firm that you will ever see, marginal costs will always be rising, okay? So sometimes it's possible the marginal costs are constant. You will see later on, not in this course, but in later courses, cases where that's true, constant marginal costs and so on. But as a rough approximation, it's the most common case, right? The more you produce of something, the more expensive it gets to produce further and further units of that thing, okay? So this is how we justified rising marginal costs last time. So if you look at profit, so ignore the marginal revenue, marginal cost columns for now. What is profit? Is total revenue minus total cost. That's profit. So this firm, when it's producing nothing, it's incurring costs of 5. Those $5 are basically fixed costs, right? So the profit it makes is -5 then. If it increases production by 1 unit, the price on the market is 10, it incurs costs of 9. So here there is the $5 of fixed costs plus there must be an additional $4 of costs incurred because of that first unit. Yeah? Makes a profit of 1 and so on and so forth. You compute the profit and you get this. Note that profit first increases with quantity and then decreases, right? So up to 3, 4 units, profit rises with quantity. The more you produce, the more profit you're getting, total. But after 4 units, the profit starts to fall. And if we were to continue the table, the profit would fall further with higher quantities. So here, the profit maximizing quantity is going to be 3 or 4. Right? 3 or 4, both have the highest possible profit. Can we see that from the marginal revenue, marginal cost columns, right? So what I'm saying here is that, of course, you can always compute total revenue, compute total costs, subtract total costs from total revenue, arrive at the profits, and just find the maximum there. I mean, when you're given the numbers like this, it's very straightforward to do. So kind of you can stop there, right? But you can also find out the profit maximizing quantity, which in this case is 3 or 4, another way, by looking at the marginal quantities. Here, marginal revenue versus marginal cost. So as I said, here we're in a perfectly competitive world. The price is constant with respect to quantity. Marginal revenue, therefore, is always the same. It's just the price that is given by the market. Okay? Marginal cost rises. So it starts at $4 for the first unit. Going from 0 to 1, you pay, the firm pays an extra $4 for that additional unit. Then $6, $8, $10 for the last unit produced. For the first is $4, for the second unit, 6, third, 8, and so on. Right? How can we see that the profit maximizing quantity is 3 or 4? Look at the marginal cost. It starts below marginal revenue. Right? So going from 0 to 1, the firm gains $10 in revenue, but also pays $4 more in costs. Right? But it's worthwhile going from 0 to 1 because the $10 of extra revenue outweigh the $4 of extra costs. Is it worthwhile going from 1 to 2? Yes, because the $10 extra are more than of revenue, are more than the 6 extra costs of $6 extra of costs. Going from 2 to 3 again is profitable, right? More additional revenue than the additional costs. You stop when you go from 3 to 4. Going from 3 to 4, the additional revenue that you get is the $10, but the additional costs incurred are also $10. So that's basically where the profits will flatten out. Okay, so the going from 3 to 4 doesn't increase profits, yeah, because the additional costs completely offset the additional revenue that you get from that extra unit. So you know that that's where the maximum is going to be. Okay, it's going to be at 3 or 4. Yeah. Indeed, if you go further, as marginal costs rise even further, the next unit, going from 4 to 5, the next unit incurs the additional cost of $12, but the additional revenue is only $10. So it's not worth increasing production from 4 to 5. Yeah? So this is an illustration of the correspondence between total and marginal quantities, which allows us to determine the optimal quantity to be produced, optimal in the sense of profit maximization, using the marginal side. Yeah? Like this. So you can look at the marginal profit to be made from the additional units. So whenever it's positive, you should produce more. Whenever it's negative, you should increase production. Whenever it's negative, you should decrease production, right? We can also represent this graphically. Yeah. You can draw a diagram where there is marginal revenue. As I said, competitive firm, price taking, therefore this is going to be a straight line. It's just constant because the x-axis here is quantity. And the marginal cost here is rising. Okay, so this particular example, it rises with constant slope. So where is going to be the profit maximizing quantity? At the intersection of these two, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Right? So how do we arrive at that? Graphically, this is the alternative explanation from the table. Instead of using numbers, we can just look at this. We can say, suppose that the firm were producing at a quantity less than the one at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue, right? Because marginal costs are rising, marginal revenue is constant, it must mean that marginal revenue is below marginal cost. Sorry, above marginal cost. At that point, the firm is making some marginal profit from that additional quantity, right? So an additional unit will bring in the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost in extra profits. So it should increase production. If you were to produce more than the quantity at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue, then the opposite occurs, right? The marginal costs are higher than marginal revenue, so it should decrease production. So the point at which there is no more incentive to change the quantity is going to be the one where there is equality between the two. So this is a graphical illustration of the argument that you can make numerically, like that, okay? So any other quantity will result in profits which are lower than this one. Okay, so this is the one this is the quantity that maximizes profits. Now, what happens if the price goes up? Again, let me reiterate this point. Price-taking behavior by perfectly competitive firms simply means that the firm doesn't have control over the price for its product. It doesn't mean that the price is always the same. It can change because of circumstances which are outside its control. Yeah? Price-taking behavior simply means that it cannot change the price by changing the quantity that it's producing. But it's still possible that because of changes, let's say, on the demand side of the market, the price that prevails on the market changes. Suppose that there are indeed many sellers of this identical product, which and these sellers are all in perfect competition. They cannot affect the price by changing their quantities. But it could be that something happens on the demand side, and there is more demand for this good, right? So the typical examples are things like, let's say there's, so news comes out that this thing is actually good for your health, and then people consume more of that, right? It's, all the time you get this crappy so-called science reporting, which where they're always taking some extremely limited study that somebody did about the effects of some compound on some various health outcomes. And if you read the paper that the scientists write, it's full of qualifications, full of, we must be careful when interpreting this. So we found that one of the compounds in coffee has a positive effect on the elasticity of the arteries in mice. And we did it with a sample of 20 mice or something like that. Yeah, but we must be very careful about interpreting these results. That's what the paper typically will say. These scientists who did that, and the news reporters go, coffee prevents heart disease. This is the typical way in which this is put forward. If you learn, by the way, anything about anything from statistics, so of course actually, I don't know, do all of you take statistics, econometrics courses? Must you? No, right? Okay. For those of you who are unfortunately forced to take econometrics, I hope that you will learn one thing, which is to be extremely skeptical of any claims about, this causes that. We use statistics to show that this causes that coffee improves heart function or something, right? Whenever you see something like that, at least one of the things that you should be able to do is see what's wrong with that kind of causal claim. That's what econometrics, by the way, is all about. Yeah. So econometrics is not about linear algebra, about variance covariance matrices and robust standard errors and all heteroscedasticity and all this crap that you're going to learn. Okay. If you're going to do econometrics, it's about one central question, which is, when can we use statistics to say that X causes Y? Yeah, don't forget that. If your instructor for econometrics starts going on about this and that and never talks about causality, ask for a refund. Okay, this is what econometrics is all about: causal inference. Okay, anyway, so back to the example of something. Let's say it's coffee, and it's now been shown, according to this crappy newspaper reporting, that it helps with heart function, heart disease, and all that. So the demand for coffee rises. As we know, so as demand rises, the price will rise, everything else constant, right? So the price rises from P1 to P2. So what happens at the individual firm level? So we know what happens at the aggregate level in a competitive market, right? So this is this is what you looked at in the first half of the course, what we've been using when analyzing situations like introduction of taxes and so on and so forth, right? But now we are interested in finding out what happens at the individual firm level. Yeah, what happens at the level of an individual producer? This is something that is new, right? So you know how to draw demand and supply diagrams and how to shift one or the other and find out the equilibrium price. Now we are asking a different question. Suppose that the price seen by the producers, by the individual sellers, changes. How do their quantity decisions change? Okay. So recall, when the price was P1, the quantity produced was Q1 because that was the quantity that maximized profits, right? Any lower than that, and marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, so they should increase quantity. Any higher than that, marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, so they should reduce quantity. And this Q1 is the point at which the two forces balance out exactly and profits are maximized. Now, suppose the price goes up from P1 to P2. What happens? From the point of view of the individual firm, marginal revenue changes. The additional amount of revenue that the firm gets from producing more changes. It goes up, right? So this means that at quantities where previously it wouldn't have been worthwhile to produce because the additional revenue for those quantities is outweighed by the additional costs, now it might be profitable to produce at those quantities because they're getting more. The firm is getting more revenue for those additional units. Yeah? So the idea here is that at Q2, it wasn't profitable to produce there, right? When the price was just P1. When the price was just P1, the firm would have made the additional revenue that it gets from going up to Q2 is outweighed by the additional costs of producing at Q2, right? So it's only getting P1, but it's incurring costs that are higher than that. But if the price rises to P2, now it's worthwhile to produce at those levels, okay, at the level of Q2. Now, the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost is further down with a higher quantity. The quantities which incur higher marginal costs now are profitable still because the price has risen, because the additional revenue that the firm gets has risen. So that's why the quantity goes up. The quantity that the firm should produce, right? So staying at Q1, when the prices goes from P1 to P2, is not the best that the firm can do. Yeah? Suppose the firm starts at receiving price P1, is producing Q1. This is how it was doing business. Then, as I said, there is a scientific discovery that coffee is good for you. This is a coffee producer. It's one of the thousands of coffee places that exist, all making basically the same identical product. And the price goes up. It's no longer the best to produce at Q1. Q1 is no longer the profit maximizing quantity, right? It's obvious because at Q1, the marginal revenue is now higher. Marginal revenue now is P2, is higher than the marginal cost. So the firm should increase quantity. And it keeps doing that until it reaches Q2, the point at which the new marginal revenue equal to the price equals marginal cost. So the costs have not changed. Okay? Nothing on the cost side has changed. Right? It's the same. The price has gone up, which means that the profit maximizing quantity goes up too. And we can do this for any price level. Tell me any price, and I will tell you the quantity that the firm should produce. Where is that quantity? It's simply along the marginal cost curve. Any price here, any price below, above. Given that price, how do I read off the quantity that is being produced? Just go to the right until you get to the marginal cost curve. Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that quantity is the quantity that is being produced for any price. So this means that the marginal cost curve will give us the quantity produced at any given price, which is another way of saying that the marginal cost curve is the supply function of the individual firm. Yeah. What is the supply function, the supply curve? Right? Is the answer to the question, given a particular price, how much should the firm produce? Okay? So that's what the supply curve is telling us. The quantity produced at a given price. Yeah? So this is something that makes sense only in the context of a competitive firm. In the context of the competitive firm, recall the competitive firm takes prices given. You give it a price and it decides how much to produce according to that price. Yeah? So the schedule of quantities corresponding to different prices that the firm receives is the supply curve, is the supply function. Right? So again, the supply function or the supply curve tells us the quantity that is being produced by a competitive firm for different prices. Different prices, different quantities. The relationship between these two is given by the supply curve. This is what it means. Okay? And this is unique to a perfectly competitive firm. The moment a firm is allowed to change prices, it has some influence on the price, the concept of the supply curve makes no sense whatsoever. Okay? To repeat, in the competitive case, for a competitive firm, the firm takes prices as given. Right? Price is exogenous, we say in economics. Price is coming from outside. It is told a price. It does this thing where it equates marginal revenue, marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals marginal price. Equals price. It equates that to marginal cost and decides how much to produce. So, given a price, there is a quantity that maximizes profit for that price. And the correspondence between the two, the relationship between the two, is given by the supply curve. For other kinds of firms, this is not true. The moment you can alter the price that you charge by changing the quantity that you're producing, it doesn't make sense anymore to ask the question, okay, so here's the price, how much are you going to produce? Right? A firm that can decide the price as well as the quantity, it doesn't make sense to ask it, given a price, how much would you produce? Right? Because it can change both. The relationship in price and quantity is something that it controls. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. There is no relationship between price and quantity, right, that is given by something like a supply curve. Right? Supply curve, given a price, how much is the quantity? Yeah? We will see in the case of a monopolist or in the case of any firm which has any market power, the supply curve does not exist. It does not make sense to talk about a supply curve because it does not make sense to ask the question for a given price, what is the quantity that is going to produce? Okay? Okay, can you stop talking there? Yeah. This is the crux of the price-taking behavior. If a firm is price-taking, then you can ask for a given price, how much would be the quantity that is produced by that firm, and that's given by the quantity at which marginal cost equals that price, okay? Subject to a condition that we will discuss shortly. For other kinds of firms, this is not true. You cannot ask this question. It just doesn't make sense. If this idea of why is it that the supply curve doesn't exist for other firms, for firms other than perfectly competitive ones, is bothering you, don't worry, we will come back to it. I'm just planting that seed in your mind now so that when you encounter it next week, it will click, okay? So it's just, I hope it will take root between now and next week, okay? Just so think about that. The most important thing here is, what is the supply curve? It's a relationship between price and quantity, price that the firm faces and the quantity that the firm decides to produce for competitive firms. So remember, for competitive firms. Yeah? No other kind of firm will have a supply curve. Now, it turns out that from this individual supply curve, you can then construct the supply curve for the whole market. Yeah? So we will deal with that later. So for now, to summarize the discussion so far, you can find out how much the firm is going to produce given a particular price by looking at the quantity at which price equals marginal cost. Therefore, the marginal cost curve, the relationship between quantity and marginal cost, is going to give us the relationship between price and quantity produced. Yeah, because the quantity produced is the one at which marginal cost equals the price. And this is what defines an individual, perfectly competitive firm's supply decision, okay, supply curve. But there is a wrinkle to this. the marginal cost curve is not the firm's supply curve in its entirety. There is one condition, one further condition that needs to be satisfied for the firm to produce at the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is that it must be profitable to produce at all at that point. Okay? So we come to the question of shutdown. Actually, this is a good point at which to take a break, because it gets a little bit different from now. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 9:32. Okay, so let's continue. So we said the perfectly competitive firm, when given a particular price, will choose to produce to maximize profits where the marginal revenue, which is equal to the price, equals marginal cost. So in short, competitive firm, price equals marginal cost gives you the quantity produced. Yeah, as price varies, the quantity varies along the marginal cost curve, and this is the supply curve. We have to add one more clause to this statement. So we are describing here the behavior of a competitive firm, the quantity behavior, the quantity decisions made by a competitive firm. Right? As you change the price, the quantity changes along the marginal cost curve, as long as the firm couldn't do better but just not producing at all. Okay, so this is the caveat. So we're giving a description of the behavior of a competitive firm. One part of the description is the quantity produces for given prices, which we said is along the marginal cost curve, right? Because price equals marginal cost is the condition for profit maximizing quantity. But to that, to get a complete description of the optimal behavior of a firm, we have to add as long as the firm couldn't do better by not producing at all. So this is the additional bit that now we have to discuss. Price equals marginal cost is not enough to describe fully the behavior of a firm, because it is possible that at the point at which price equals marginal cost, it is not profitable to produce. Yeah? Instead, in certain situations, the firm should just not produce at all. Now, the situation where a firm should not produce at all, the decision to not produce has two names, depending on the circumstances. In the short run, that is, when some factors of production are fixed, right? Recall, this is the definition of short run. When some factors of production are fixed, and therefore the firm faces some fixed costs, the decision not to produce is called shutdown. It means you set the quantity to 0, but you still face the fixed costs. Okay, you still incur the fixed costs, but you're reducing the quantity to 0. This is something that can happen in the short run because there are fixed costs, which implies that there are some factors of production, some inputs are fixed. In the long run, the decision not to produce at all is called exit. Okay, and exit here means that, the long run here means that all factors of production are variable, are under the firm's control. Right? So it is possible for the firm to completely exit the market in the long run when it can choose everything in terms of its input and incur no costs at all. And sometimes that is the profitable thing to do, the thing that maximizes profits. So just to frame it again and to put it in the picture, firms always want to maximize profits. For a competitive firm, this is achieved by choosing a quantity that equates price and marginal cost, except when it could do better than that by simply not producing at all. In the short run, this is called shutdown. In the long run, it's called exiting the market. Okay? The difference between the two is, in the short run, some factors of production are fixed, and therefore fixed costs must be incurred even in the case of a shutdown, whereas in the long run, all factors of production are variable. Therefore, it is possible to completely exit and not incur any costs by producing nothing. Okay? So exit is kind of more final than shutdown, in the sense that you can avoid all costs by simply exiting. So you get zero costs, zero revenue, zero profits. Yeah? So in the short run, when the firm faces some fixed costs, again, let me emphasize this, short run doesn't mean in a short period of time. Yeah? It doesn't mean a few days, a few months, whatever. It has this particular definition here, which is when there are some factors of production that are fixed, and therefore there are some fixed costs. This is the definition of short run. Yeah? So in the short run, when there are some fixed costs to be incurred no matter what the quantity produced is, because those factors of production are fixed, typical ones being something like some costs incurred because you have a contract with a supplier, you cannot break that contract. You have to pay those costs, right? So let's say many firms have fixed leases that occur, right? So you have to stay there. Actually, it occurs even if you're renting a property privately, right? You don't have to be a firm. Even individual tenants, they have fixed leases. You cannot just decide, okay, I'm going to go stop renting this place and I'll go somewhere else. No, the landlord will make you pay the remaining rent, okay? Unless there is a specific clause that enables you to just change. This is even more true for many businesses where they sign contracts for renting an industrial warehouse, let's say. The landlord of the industrial warehouse will get the rent from you, regardless of whether you are using that industrial warehouse or not, whether you are selling anything, whether you're storing anything there or not. That's a typical fixed cost, right? It doesn't matter whether you stop running your business. Yeah? You sign the lease, maybe there are 3 months left on the lease. For those 3 months, you just have to keep paying the rent for that place. Yeah, very common. Think of it like mobile phone contracts. It's like that for individuals, right? For individuals, it's rarer, right? There are fewer things where you're kind of locked in. But there are some, right? So for example, the case of mobile phone contracts, you sign a 2-year contract and you just have to keep paying the monthly fee for those 2 years. So those are the kind of fixed costs that businesses incur. In the short run, they have to pay those fixed costs, okay? And so shutting down means that they set quantity to 0, right? So they avoid all variable costs, but they still have to incur the fixed ones. So when should it do that? When should a firm shut down? That is, when should a firm set the quantity to 0 in the short run? So it has to weigh the benefits and costs, right, of producing something versus producing nothing. If it decides to shut down, it will lose whatever revenue it could have gotten by producing something. If it shuts down, as I said, it avoids the variable costs. It cannot avoid the fixed costs. By definition, that's what short run means. So the best it can do, the most it can get out of shutting down is saving on the variable costs. So whenever total revenue is less than the variable costs, right, then it's worthwhile to shut down. Right? The condition for that, when you average it out across the quantity produced, is that price, because total revenue divided by quantity is average revenue, which we said is just price. So when price is less than variable cost divided by quantity, average variable cost. So this is why we defined average variable cost last time, is to enable us to write this condition concisely. So a firm should shut down, that is, should produce nothing in the short run when it cannot avoid some fixed costs, if the revenue that it gets is less than the variable costs. In other words, when the price it receives for each unit is less than the average variable cost of producing that many units. Okay, so price less than average variable cost, sorry, is the condition for shutdown in the short run. So I hope it's obvious why total revenue less than variable cost is the condition for shutdown, right? It's because it's not worthwhile to continue producing. The firm is paying more in costs that it can avoid by shutting down than it gets in revenue. Dividing that throughout by Q, by quantity, gives us this condition of price less than average variable costs. Okay? Again, why average variable costs? Because, and not average cost, average total cost, because the fixed costs cannot be avoided in the short run. Right? That's the definition of the short run. In the short run, there are fixed costs. You have to pay them even if you produce zero. So those costs, being unavoidable, do not enter into the decision. Yeah? You pay the fixed cost whether you're producing a positive amount or whether you're producing zero amount. It's a cost that is the same on both sides when you're evaluating the benefits of continuing production or shutting down production. Right? Therefore, they're irrelevant. We can represent this graphically, the shutdown decision. So recall we said competitive firm will produce at the point at which price equals marginal cost, right? That's the point at which it maximizes profits. And now we're adding this caveat. We're adding an additional condition as long as it's better to produce at that point than to produce nothing at all. Yeah? So there is a second bit that we're now adding, as long as it's better to produce that quantity, the quantity at which price equals marginal cost, instead of producing zero. When is it better to produce zero? When the price is less than the average variable cost in the short run. So the segment of the marginal cost curve which lies above the minimum of the average variable cost is going to be the supply curve of the firm for positive quantity. Okay, so the firm will produce a positive quantity as long as, sorry, did I say minimum? I should not say that. Like, I do not want to emphasize that point. So let me backtrack a little bit. So the portion of the marginal cost curve which is above the average variable cost curve is the firm's supply curve for positive quantities. So the firm will produce positive quantities, non-zero quantities. The firm will stay in business, will not shut down in the short run, and will produce the quantity given by the marginal cost curve as long as the marginal cost is above the average variable cost. Why marginal cost above average variable cost? Right? So we said that the condition for producing positive quantities is that the price has to be greater than or equal to the average variable cost. The condition for shutdown is price less than average variable cost. Why does that mean that the supply curve is given by the marginal cost curve along the portion that is above the average variable cost? It's because the supply curve, remember, is the quantity, gives us the quantity, the optimal quantity that a competitive firm should produce for a given price. But for all points along the supply curve, the condition that holds is price equals marginal cost. Therefore, all portion along the marginal cost curve, when we're calling the supply curve, price equals marginal cost. The portion of the marginal cost curve that is above the average variable cost, that's price equals marginal cost, the price is above average variable cost. Marginal cost is above average variable cost. Price must be higher, since this is a competitive firm that is producing at the point at which price equals marginal cost. Therefore, at those points, the red highlighted portion, price is above average variable cost, and therefore the firm should continue producing. Yeah? So the supply curve, recall, is determined by the condition price equals marginal cost. Therefore, along that red portion, price equals marginal cost, right? Which is greater than average variable cost. So that's why that's the part of the marginal cost curve which gives us the supply curve of the competitive firm for positive quantities. The portion of the marginal cost curve that is below average variable cost curve, is not a description of the optimal quantity to be produced by the firm. So what I'm saying is, down here, this segment here, it is not optimal for the firm to produce where price equals marginal cost, to produce these quantities. So for example, if price were here, following blindly the instruction to produce where price equals marginal cost would imply producing this quantity here. That is not optimal. When price is down here, the price is below the average variable cost at this quantity. At this quantity, average variable costs are up here, price is down here. So it's optimal to just shut down completely, right, and produce nothing at all. And this holds true for all prices up to this point, where marginal cost equals average variable cost. So the supply curve of the competitive firm will be given for the range of prices which are for the portion of the marginal cost curve where marginal cost is less than average variable cost, is going to be given by 0. The firm should just shut down altogether. So what it looks like is this. Actually, if you want to be technical, it could also produce actually, no, let's forget about that part. So here, so what I'm saying is, this portion of the marginal cost curve below the average variable cost curve is not the firm's supply curve. The firm should not produce at the quantities given by this curve here, because it would do better to just produce nothing at all, because at least it avoids the variable costs. If it produces quantities here, right? So suppose the price is here at this level, price equals marginal cost would tell you to produce there, but at that point, the average variable cost is higher than the price, and therefore you would incur, you would do better to just not produce at all and incur just the fixed costs. And that's why the supply curve is just vertical here for this portion, for the portion where the price and the marginal costs are below the average variable cost. Okay? So in the short run, a competitive firm supply curve is made of two segments. One segment is the simple one, price equals marginal cost. It's just the marginal cost curve. The other portion is the portion below the average variable cost curve, which is simply quantity equals 0. The firm will shut down if it cannot even cover its variable costs by producing some amount. Okay? So here there is, for prices in this region, there is no quantity that will generate higher profits than simply, no positive quantity that will generate higher profits than simply not producing at all. Because by not producing at all, it incurs the fixed cost, but it avoids all variable costs. But any quantity given here will incur variable costs which are higher than the price it receives for those units, resulting in profits which are lower than not producing at all. So this is an illustration of the notion of sunk costs. So fixed costs are sunk. It means the fixed costs, as long as they exist, cannot be avoided. Right? So it cannot. So the firm cannot avoid paying those costs. Recall. So again, fixed costs is. how shall I put it? The categorization of whether a given cost is fixed or not is down to one thing. Can the cost be avoided by reducing the quantity? Can the cost be changed by reducing the quantity? Yeah? If it cannot, if the cost must be incurred even when producing zero, then that's a fixed cost. Yeah? So that's a key characteristic of a fixed cost. Therefore, it means that the cost, as in the short run, if it cannot be avoided, even by producing zero, in the short run, it's a sunk cost. Sunk means that it is irrelevant for decision making. Sunk means that by the time the decision has to be made of whether to produce or not, whether to produce quantity equals zero or some positive quantity to try to maximize profits, the fixed cost has to be paid. There is no way to avoid that. Therefore, it's sunk. It's irrelevant to the decision making. There are many, many ways of arriving at this conclusion. So as I said, one way to think about it is simply weigh the two options. Weigh the option of producing nothing, shutting down, with continuing production. The fixed cost appears in both options. Therefore, it cancels out from both. It doesn't matter. It's not something that will affect your decision, because it affects both of the alternatives that you're choosing between equally. Yeah? So that's the sense in which the fixed cost does not enter the decision whether to shut down or not. Yeah? And that's why we have the condition that the shutdown should occur when price is less than average variable cost rather than less than average cost in general. Yeah? What about in the long run? Well, in the long run, if all inputs are variable, there are no fixed costs. Right? You can tell whether you're in the long run or not by just looking at the presence of fixed costs. If there are no fixed costs, then you know that you're in the long run. Yeah? Therefore, in the long run, the decision of whether to exit or not, exit, recall, is a term that we use for producing nothing in the long run, depends on, of course, total revenue, just as before, but total costs. Not just variable costs, total costs, because essentially there are no fixed costs here. So here in the long run, the firm will exit the market if total revenue is less than total costs. I mean, this is obvious. If profit is negative, the firm should just exit, should produce nothing. It can avoid all costs, so it can always do better than negative profits by not producing at all, getting zero. Zero of everything. It's zero revenue, zero cost, zero profits. If you're making negative profits because total revenue is less than total cost, you can do better than that, right? Just don't produce at all and get zero profits. Of course, if you divide throughout by quantity, you get the condition, which is firm should exit if the price is less than the average total cost, so average costs. Conversely, you would enter the market or stay in the market if you're already there if total revenues exceed total costs. In that case, price greater than average total cost. In that case, you're making positive profit. If you were to exit, you would make zero, right? So you're better off staying or entering the market. There is this pesky case. What exactly happens when total revenue equals total cost? Yeah? At that point, you are indifferent between entering, exiting the market. Yeah? So there is a third possibility here, which is the point at which total revenue exactly equals total cost. I might discuss this later today. But let's see how we're doing with time. Okay. So, again, this is the parallel to the shutdown decision. Shutdown decision in the short run, in the presence of fixed costs, depends on average variable cost. If the price that you're receiving for the units that you're producing covers at least the average variable cost, stay, continue producing at the point at which price equals marginal cost. If not, if at the point at which price equals marginal cost, you wouldn't even be able to cover the average variable costs, then shut down, that is, produce zero. That way you will just pay the fixed costs, which is better than paying the fixed costs plus the average variable costs, which won't even cover the, won't be covered by the price that you're receiving for those units. Okay? Which means, by the way, that in the short run, it is possible for a firm to continue producing and making negative profits. It's possible because even though the price is bigger than the average variable cost, it's possible that the fixed costs are large enough that total profits are negative, right? Average costs, so the costs are fixed costs plus variable costs. So it's possible that you incur negative profits in the short run. In the long run, negative profits are not possible. It is not possible for a competitive firm to stay in a market, continue producing, and incur negative profits, because it can avoid all costs simply by exiting, even fixed costs. I mean, there are none in the long run. Therefore, the worst that a firm can do in the long run is just not be there and get zero profits. Yeah. So, differences between short run and long run. In the short run, shut down if price is less than average variable cost. In the long run, exit if price is less than average total cost. This means that when the opposite is true, when price is at least average variable cost, when price is at least average total cost, then produce where price equals marginal cost. This is a description of the competitive firm's behavior in the short and long run. So in the long run, again, it's the same as before. There are two portions of the supply curve. As long as marginal cost is above this point, is above average total cost, then it should produce where price equals marginal cost. Below that, the price at the point at which price equals marginal cost cannot possibly cover the average costs, so it's better to just exit the market altogether and produce zero. Yeah. So the supply curve always has these two portions. One portion which is the usual, the intuitive price equals marginal cost part, following the marginal cost curve, therefore. The other part is the part which is below the average cost curve in the long run, average variable cost curve in the short run, where quantity is just zero. So, this asks you to figure out where the profit, how to read the profit of these graphs. But let me just show you. So where can we find the profit? So I've been talking about profit, if the profit is positive, negative, something like that. Can we read off the profit? Yes, if we have the average total cost. So here everything is in average terms, right? This is in per unit terms, all the curves, marginal revenue, average costs, marginal costs. How can we read off profits? Well, it's the difference between total revenue, profit is the difference between total revenue and total cost. Therefore, it's the difference between average revenue and average cost times the quantity. Okay? So if you have averages, you can read off the profit simply by multiplying by the quantity. So it's going to be some kind of rectangle in a graph where you have average measures. So, for example, if the price is $10, at quantity 50, the average total costs are 6, according to this graph. So at quantity 50, the profits are going to be $4 per unit times the 50 gives us $200. So the profit is always given by this rectangle. The height of the rectangle is the difference between the price and average total costs or average costs. The width of the rectangle, the base, is going to be given by the quantity, right? And it follows from the definitions, because the average revenue is always equal to price. So this is a situation where a firm makes a loss instead, right? So the price is below the average total cost at the quantity at which price equals marginal cost, right? So here the firm makes a loss of $2 per unit. Price is 3. if the firm were to blindly follow the condition price equals marginal cost, it would produce 30 units. But at 30 units, average total costs are 5, 2 more than the price. So it would make a loss of $2 per unit times the 30 units that it's producing, $60 of loss. Yeah. So that's an illustration. You can illustrate the points at which it does not make sense to produce a positive amount according to price equals marginal cost, yeah, if you're making a loss per unit and therefore in total. So recall we discussed the supply curve at the individual firm level. So this is what we've been doing up to now. So far we've discussed what is the quantity that is being produced at any given price by an individual firm, and the answer to that question is if the price is above average variable cost in the short run or average total cost in the long run, then the quantity is going to be given by the point at which price equals marginal cost. Otherwise, the quantity is going to be 0. This is the individual supply curve. How can we get the market supply curve? The thing, the upward sloping thing that you've been drawing all along so far, right? So the demand and supply diagrams that you love to draw and move the curves around and find the equilibrium price, all of that, that comes from somewhere. It comes from the individual supply curves of the firms. Each individual firm has a supply curve. You somehow aggregate them, put them together, and you get the market supply curve. To do that, we need some assumptions. To be able to draw the curve the way we've been drawing it, there are some assumptions that are useful. So one assumption that we're going to make at all the firms and all the possible firms that could be in the market, not just the firms that are in the market, but also potential firms that could be in the market, they are identical. In particular, they have identical costs. So we'll assume that the costs don't change depending on the number of firms in the market. That's another assumption that we'll make. Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether there are 100 firms or 1,000 firms, the costs, individual costs, are independent of the number of other firms that there are in the market. This is, of course, not necessarily true. These are, I want to emphasize that they are strong assumptions, right? In reality, of course, the firms don't have identical costs. Some firms are more efficient at doing the very same thing than others, right? For various reasons. Similarly, the number of other firms could affect an individual firm's costs. It's possible, right? That there are positive externalities due to the presence of other firms. Maybe there are more firms there are that do the same thing as you, the more benefits you get from various things like, let's say, the spillovers of the training of the other firms, right? If you are, in a sense, that's why you have places like Silicon Valley, right? So there's lots of firms doing similar things. The more firms there are doing similar things, the bigger the workforce, for example, the trained workforce that could be working for you, and that could make things cheaper for you. Yeah. So these are strong assumptions. Okay, so they're assumptions that are deviations from what you usually observe in reality. Nevertheless, we're going to make them because they make life much easier. Okay, so identical firms, both in the market and potentially in the market. The firms' individual costs are independent of each other. Yeah, so it's not that having fewer firms makes things more expensive for me to produce, more firms makes it cheaper, or anything like that. And so we will analyze two cases. One case is the short run, where the number of firms is fixed, and the long run, where the number of firms is not fixed. So this is where it gets confusing. Okay, so I don't want to use the terms short run and long run. Yeah, so the book uses this term. Now, the confusion arises from this. What does short and long run mean, right? We discussed it in terms of factors of production being fixed or variable. Let's keep it that way. The definition, let's keep one definition, short and long run, which is factors of production are fixed in the short run. All factors of production, some factors of production are fixed in the short run. All factors of production are variable in the long run. We will talk about fixed number of firms and variable number of firms. Yeah? I will try to avoid using the term short run, long run when referring to the number of firms in the market. I hope you can see how this can cause confusion. If I say short run, do I mean factors of production are fixed, or do I mean number of firms is fixed? Yeah? So I will mean the former. Short run, long run, I will use it only to describe, this is for the purposes of the exam. Okay, so I'm telling you now, if you see the terms short run, long run in the exam, it is about the factors of production. It is not about the number of firms in the market, okay? So if during the exam, actually you cannot ask questions, I realized. Here, you take the exam, like, apparently I'm not involved at all in the invigilation of the exam. Maybe you're finding out that right now. But yeah, this place is different from usual. Most universities, the person who sets the exam has to stand there in the exam room to answer questions about the exam, right? Yeah, because sometimes the exam questions could be ambiguous. But apparently here that doesn't occur. I am actually not allowed to go into the exam room at all or something. So I'm supposed to sit in my office, twiddle my thumbs or something. And maybe they will give me a call. But anyway, so if in doubt, for this course, you see short run, it just means one thing. Some factors of production are fixed. Long run, it means all factors of production are variable. If I want to talk about the number of firms, I'm going to say fixed number of firms versus variable number of firms. Is that clear? Yeah? Please do not ask that question in the exam. Nobody will be able to answer it for you. So just remember this. Okay? So, arriving at the market supply curve. So the market supply curve, the market supply curve is the summation of the individual firms' supply curves. We just add them up. Okay. So if you have, let's say 1,000 identical firms, and so the quantity in the market is going to be simply 1,000 times the quantity that each firm would produce. Yeah. So for a fixed number of firms, this is the case of a fixed number of firms. So let's say at this price, P1, this is the lowest price at which the firms will individual firms will produce something, right? Recall that for any price less, we know that because that's the point at which marginal cost is exactly equal to average variable cost. Above that, they will produce along the marginal cost curve. Below that, they will just produce 0. So there, when price is P1, each firm produces 10. If there's 1,000 of these firms, the total quantity produced in the market will be 10,000, right? If you have a price higher than that, then it's again going to be given by the marginal cost curve. So let's say here at that price, the quantity is 20 times 1,000, because there's 1,000 firms in this case, we get 20,000, and so on and so forth. So we find the supply curve, the market supply curve, simply by adding up all of the individual firms' supply curves. Because we said that all the firms are identical, have identical costs, therefore they have identical marginal cost curves, the market supply curve is going to be given by the individual supply curve times by the number of firms. Right? And that's why we get this. As long as price is above the average variable cost, which is the same for all firms, so it's the same threshold. Below that, the market supply curve is going to be 0. It's not represented here, but at price less than P1, because P1, see, is the point at which it's better to shut down. For prices less than P1, firms should shut down here. The supply curve is going to be perfect, even for both the individual firm and the market, is going to be perfectly vertical at 0. Okay, it's not depicted, not a big deal here. Yeah. Okay, so we know it's a short run because we have average variable cost being represented here, right? This is what determines whether the firm should produce 0 or not, the average variable cost. That's how we know we're in the short run. Moreover, on top of that, we have a fixed number of firms, okay, so which is 1,000. So in the what the textbook calls long run, but again it's confusing to call it that because it conflicts with the early definition. When the number of firms is variable, yeah, when there is free entry and exit, this is where that assumption that I talked about at the very beginning comes into play. Free entry and exit means that there's nothing stopping firms from entering and exiting the market. Examples of things that would stop firms from entering the market are government regulation. Right? There are many situations where governments limit the number of firms in the market. Right? The typical examples are things like systems, situations where the providers of some service need a license to operate. Right? And the license is in fixed numbers. For example, taxis. Right? So governments give fixed number of taxi licenses. There can be no more than what the government decides is the right number of taxi licenses. Yeah? So that's a situation where there isn't free entry or exit. Situations where there is free entry and exit means that firms can enter the market, can start producing, and there is nothing that stops them from doing so, except perhaps the fact that it wouldn't be profitable to do so. Right? So free entry and exit means that the decision whether to enter or exit the market is determined purely by the profitability of doing so, yeah? Rather than something like government regulation, which is the usual example of not free entry and exit, restricted entry and exit. There can even be restricted exit. So it's common to have restricted entry, right? So you have a number of licenses and no more firms can enter the market. So that's pretty intuitive. There's also restricted exit. So there are some markets where firms are not allowed to exit. They can't say, oh, I'm making losses, I want to quit this business. This is a really unprofitable business. No, the government forces them to stay in business. Maybe they would pay them some subsidies or something, but they have some contract with the government, they have some regulations such that they have to stay. Typical examples here are public transport services. In many countries, the private companies that run public transport systems, they have to continue providing those services even if they're making a loss. Okay? They are tied down by the government. They typically will receive some kind of subsidy from the government, but even if they're economically unprofitable, they have to continue operating. Anyway, so we're discussing the case where there is variable number of firms because firms can enter and exit the market freely. Yeah? So what happens to the supply in the market when there is free entry and exit? What happens to the number of firms in the market? So what will the mechanism that we use to describe, to arrive at the number of firms in the market is one where if the existing firms in the market are making positive profits, then new firms enter the market. Right? There are profitable opportunities for new firms to enter, and they will do so, and the number of firms will increase. If the existing firms in the market incur losses, then it's not profitable for some of those firms to stay in the market, and they will start exiting. So this is what determines the number of firms in the market, whether the ones already there in that market are profitable or not. If they're profitable, number of firms goes up. If they're not profitable, number of firms goes down. And that will change the supply of the quantity produced in the whole market, right? Because if more firms enter the market, the quantity will go up. If fewer firms enter the market, the quantity will go down. Given the description that I just gave you, given that firms will enter the market if there are positive profits to be made, there are positive profits being made, exit the market if there are negative profits being made. Recall that here firms are identical. What is the point at which the number of firms will not change? There will be no incentive for firms to either exit or enter the market. That's the point at which profits are exactly equal to 0. That's the equilibrium where the number of firms is, which will determine the number of firms. When there is no incentive for firms to exit because there are negative profits, no incentives to enter because there are positive profits, this must mean that profits are 0. Zero profits is what determines the number of firms that will exist in the market. Okay? Because for any other profit level, either positive or negative, there will be either entry or exit. So the market will not be in equilibrium with respect to the number of firms. So when do you get 0 profit? When price equals average cost, average total cost, right? That's the definition of, the definition of 0 profit is total revenue equals total cost, divide throughout by quantity, and you get average revenue equals average total cost. But average revenue is just price, so it's average. So it's price equals average total cost. So that's where 0 profit occurs. Moreover, because competitive firms produce where price equals marginal cost, this situation where there's no incentive to enter or exit the market will occur not just when price equals average total cost, but also when price equals marginal cost and average total cost. And furthermore, this is from one of the last slides last week. Sorry, not last week, the last time. Where does marginal cost equal average total cost? It equals average total cost at the minimum of the latter. So this was the example of the GPA, right? What happens to your GPA if you're taking a course where you will get a mark that is higher than your GPA, then your GPA, which is the average, will increase. Lower, it will decrease. The point at which, and the minimum, so the point at which the two are equal is the point at which the average is minimized, right? So the point of all this discussion is that the point at which the number of firms has no incentive to change, there is no incentive to enter or exit the market, is the point at which the price equals the minimum of the average total cost. So that's lots and lots of conditions. So we had condition for profit maximization, as long as it is profitable to produce positive quantities, is price equals marginal cost. Condition for continuing production in the short run is price is at least equal to, greater than or equal to average variable cost, shut down if price is less than average variable cost. Condition for continuing production in the long run, when all factors of production are variable, is price greater than average total cost. Exit if price is less than average total cost. Condition for the number of firms to be in equilibrium, for there to be no incentive to enter or exit the market, is that price equals the minimum average total cost, because that's the point at which price equals marginal cost equals average total cost. Okay, so there's lots of conditions there. There are 4 conditions that we've discussed. So what does 0 profit mean? So this is something that is very counterintuitive. It's something that people find hard to swallow. So let's take stock of where we are. So when the number of firms can vary, when firms can enter or exit the market, there will be some kind of equilibrium, some kind of situation where things are stable, when there are no more firms that want to enter the market, no more firms that want to exit the market. That's our definition of equilibrium as far as the number of firms is concerned. Yeah. The market will be in equilibrium in terms of the number of firms there when, as I said, price equals marginal cost equals average total cost, which is the point at which average total costs are lowest. Which means that the equilibrium in terms of the number of firms will occur where firms are making zero profit. But then you might think, but why, how can it be that the equilibrium in a market is for firms to make no profit whatsoever? Why do they even bother staying in business? Yeah. So when you do A-level economics or something, you will have heard this thing, and that in the long run, and as I said, I don't want to use that term in this context, but the market will be such that firms will make zero profit. So zero profit characterizes perfect competition. No. Perfect competition is characterized first and foremost by price-taking behavior. This is the most important thing. This is what I emphasize for most of today. Price-taking behavior, which leads to price equals quantity produced being determined by price equals marginal cost. This is the hallmark of perfect competition. This is what singles out perfect competition from all other market conditions. Okay? Price-taking behavior. If on top of that you add this condition of free entry and exit, then you get this result that the number of firms will be in equilibrium when all of the firms are making zero profit. But this is weird. Like, how can it be that all of the firms are making zero profits? Right? Where do we observe in reality situations where firms are making zero profit? So the objection, but it's so unrealistic. Firms don't make zero profit in reality. This objection comes out of a misunderstanding of what profit means. Recall from last time that what we mean by profit is economic profit, not accounting profit. Making zero economic profit is perfectly consistent with making positive accounting profit. Perfectly consistent. Indeed, in reality, in whatever approximation we have of perfectly competitive markets where firms are making zero economic profits, they will individually be making positive accounting profits. So think of setting up your own business, right? So you do all the things I told you not to do, but you do it anyway. You use your own savings, you work in that business and all that. So think about, for example, so you are self-employed in your own business, and you're making zero economic profit. Does that mean that you're not making any profit on paper? No. You will typically be making some accounting profit. The price that you charge is going to be greater than the average total cost in accounting terms, in terms of the outlays that you're making, the amount of money that you're paying to your suppliers and so on. Yeah? But there is usually one cost that is implicit. Remember, that's the difference between economic costs and opportunity costs, economic costs, and on the one hand, and accounting costs on the other, which is implicit cost. There is usually one implicit cost, which in many businesses is kind of ignored, which is the cost of finance. It's the cost of using your own capital. So many small businesses, that's what they do. They use their own savings for operating capital. Now, using your own savings, recall, incurs an implicit opportunity cost due to the opportunity cost, the opportunities for other investment that you have foregone in order to run this business of yours. It's when you account for that profits are going to be zero. So, what economics is telling you, what this theory of perfect competition is telling you is that if you were to enter a perfectly competitive market, and the market settles to some kind of equilibrium, yeah, once you've taken into account all implicit costs, for example, the implicit cost of supplying your own capital and so on, the implicit cost of your own labor and all that, once you've taken all of those into account, you will make zero profits. But on paper, the amount of the costs that you will be paying out are usually going to be lower than the price that you're receiving. So on paper, you will be making an accounting profit. Yeah? It's only when you factored in all of the implicit costs that you are making zero profit. So it doesn't mean that everybody actually is paying exactly as much per unit produced as it's getting in price, in revenue per unit. That's not what this is saying. This is including, in terms of outlay of money, yeah, in terms of accounting. It's in terms of economic costs. Yeah. So the typical small business, which uses its own finance, uses its own labor, and so on, they will be making positive accounting profits. They will just be making zero economic profits, according to this.